In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A reading from the book of Ezekiel. For I will take you out of the nations, gather you from all the countries, and bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and to be careful of all my commandments. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people and I will be your God. Amen. Amen. So this talk I'm just going to call either Journey into Lent, Journey into Love. Lent is a journey into love, or call it Lent is for lovers. So I like Lent is for lovers. And I like it, especially, I was going to preach on this on Ash Wednesday, but decided not to. I love the fact that Ash Wednesday this year fell on Valentine's Day. Because in a way, I'm serious. Lent is for lovers. By the way, the last time Ash Wednesday fell on Valentine's Day was 1945. So I know it's kind of, but think of it this way: I love the connection, but Lent, and I'm serious about this. Lent is for love. Lent is for lovers, because love is supposed to be sacrificial and putting somebody else before yourself. In a way, isn't that what we're trying to get to in 40 days of Lent? And so I just want to draw out the theme between love and Lent. And it starts with the idea of the garden. Now, garden in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's the place where lovers meet. Right in the Garden of Eden, that's where lovers meet. In the Song of Songs, they meet in the garden. And so when you ever hear the word image of garden in the Bible, think, that's where lovers meet. And it starts with the second creation story. Just going to review this. Remember, there's two creation stories, and they don't match each other. They're not supposed to. And I've had several people ask me to stop saying that there's two different creation stories. So let me tell you, there's two different creation stories. And they're stating two different truths. So the second creation story, that's the one known as Adam and Eve. And in the Hebrew, what it is, it starts much different. In the Hebrew, God creates Ha-Adam. Ha means the, Adam means earthling. So God scoops up the earth, and the word for that is Ha-Adamah, and makes Ha-Adam. So do you get the connection? Earth and we're made from the earth. But technically, Ha-Adam doesn't say whether it's male or female. And if you read it in the Hebrew, oddly enough, the story doesn't say who's created first, male or female. And that's the point. We're created for each other. But, just because it's easier in English pronouns to say he, I'm going to say he. So God creates the earthling. And the earthlings in paradise, in the garden, but there's a problem. Now that should strike you as strange. If he's in paradise, why would there be a problem? And the problem is loneliness. And so he's lonely. And in the story, I just love the story, he has everything that should make him happy. He's in the garden, has vast real estate holdings, still doesn't make him happy. He can name all the animals, but not even knowledge makes him happy, and he prays for a savior. And so God puts the earthling to death. It says in the sleep of death, but it means death. And he puts him in the sleep of death, and he takes, good poetry has ambiguity in it. So in English it says he took his rib, but the word for in Hebrew for like one side of yourself and your rib bone is actually the same exact word. So you don't know if you're reading it, did he take half the earthling or just the rib bone? And that's the point. You're not a complete human being until you find your other half. And the reason why it says, we translate it as rib bones, the ancient Jews said this: if God would have taken a bone from man's head, woman would try and dominate man. If God would have taken a bone from man's foot, man would try and dominate woman. But if he takes the bone closest to his heart, he'll realize he's incomplete without somebody to love. And so the idea of, think about the missing rib, a split side in Hebrew, if your side can be split open, that means you can love to the point of death. And then when the man and the woman awake, then God calls them human beings. So the idea is that you're not born a true human being. You only awake to your humanity when you can love to the point of death, when you can sacrifice yourself. Then your true humanity is born. Did I lose anybody on that? Because a lot of that's very symbolic thinking. Anybody get lost on that? So, in one sense, that's a beautiful story, love it. But early Christians, when they read the crucifixion or heard the crucifixion, the image is that they'd say, it's a second creation story. Because here you have Jesus in the Garden of the Garden of Gethsemane. And the sad part is this happens before the cross and nobody shows up. If you reread it, nobody shows up in the garden. Jesus is praying, but it's a sad story. The beloved, us, don't show up. They fall asleep. And when Jesus is crucified, just a little background. I know I've gone over this before, but it's kind of important. If you notice the altar panels in the church, they're all wedding symbols, if you go look at it. And so when you're married in first century Judaism, you get a couple things. The only day, unless you're king, what you get to wear on your wedding day is a crown. And you get to wear this liturgical garment called a katun. It's what the high priest would wear. So Jesus, when he dies, he has the crown of thorns. Does that make sense? And oddly enough, he's wearing a wedding garment. It's also a garment the high priest would wear, so the ambiguity means both. But it's a whole wedding ceremony. And the wedding ceremony starts even before the crown and the wedding dress. It starts with, if I was going to, you married him, right? And she married him for his insurance. True love.
That's true.
In first century, the wedding ceremony starts with offering her a cup. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ prays about this cup of suffering. It's going to be a cup of sacrifice. And and if you remember, when he's on the cross, his side is split open. And from his side is born us, the church. It's this image of a true human being who can love to the point of death. So the crucifixion is kind of this Genesis love story. So pause there. Does that make sense to people, how the crucifixion is a love story? Even the Garden of Gethsemane. And when he's in the garden, let me just back up. I just love this image. A couple fall in love, and I know that I'm very cynical. They fall in love, they have a great reception, they dance. What they won't get at that time, at least I feel this, most 20-year-olds don't get that they're really committing themselves to a life of sacrifice. And unfortunately, things like, and I know this is your favorite show, The Bachelor, and Who Wants to Marry a Millionaire. The American version of love is that when you find your true partner, all you'll ever have is incredible bliss. The Catholic idea, and there's no way to explain this. The Catholic idea is that no, what you've committed yourself to is a life of sacrifice. But what gets born is your true humanity. I don't know how you can explain that to young people, but that's what our symbols are about. And so they'd say, don't marry somebody who can't have their sides split open. If all they can do is live for themselves, it's going to be a horrible marriage. So when Jesus is in the garden, he's not pained at the thought of torture and whips or rejection from those who profess to be engaged to God. He's pained because the lover hasn't shown up. And remember, religion is a marriage. Going back to this, recovering at the covenant of Sinai, when the people are at Sinai and they commit themselves to God, that's a marriage if you really read it. And so in first century Judaism, it starts with a cup, but then they take a hopa, this prayer shawl, and put it above the couple. And so the family they put on 4 poles and they hold the hopa, this prayer shawl, over the couple as they say their vows. And I love this, just the symbolism. The idea is that you can support the hopa, but it's forbidden that only the couple are allowed under the hopa. And the idea is that there's something sacred there. You get to support it, but you're not allowed to butt your nose into somebody else's marriage. Does that make any sense? At Sinai, and then the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are what's called a ketubah. And a ketubah would be when one gets married, you have this arrangement of this is what love does. And so a ketubah is kind of this marriage agreement. And if you really read the Hebrew, what God says is, I fell in love with you. I saved you. And if this marriage is going to work, this is what love does not do. You shall not, and then it goes over the 10 Commandments. But it's all about this marriage. And one of the primordial images of religion is that it's this marriage. And so when the people commit sins, they take the land, they're in Israel, and then they become corrupt. And the prophets will always say, you committed adultery. You have committed adultery. Does that make sense? They're not actually talking about fornication. It's that you've allowed another love to come into your heart. Does that make sense? So that's what the prophets mean by adultery. That you've taken on another God, another lover. And so, like in the prophet Hosea, and this is the image of Lent, finally God has had enough. And God is going to destroy the country and haul them into exile and restart. But the image of Hosea, yes, it's destruction, but it's this beautiful lover language where it's not, they're going to come in and destroy your country. Hosea is, you've fallen in love with other people. Let us start over. Let us go back into the desert. Because remember, they had to travel through the desert to get to the promise. Let us go back into the desert and fall in love, and I will whisper sweet nothings to you in your ear. You and I will fall in love again, and you will call me husband. It's this marriage image of falling back in love. And so Lent is this idea of we're going back into the desert, where we can fall in love with God again. For all the idols that we have in our hearts, Lent is a time to get rid of them. So in the garden before Jesus dies, he's there and he's praying for the lover. And so when Pilate asked Jesus, do you realize that I hold your life in my hands? Pilate doesn't realize that Jesus has already given his life away. He's not afraid. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he promised to give his life away to us, the lover. The beloved, I should say. Does that make any sense? So he's not afraid of the torch and whips because he's already given his life away. And like Martin Luther King said, you must choose death before you choose life. Whenever you're ready to die for something, then you can face evil. Does that make sense? So he's already chosen that. So Jesus is victimized, but not a victim. And our love becomes free when it's given without manipulation. When we die to fear and rejection, then you can truly love. So the cross is this Genesis image into love. And we're the ones who are searching the garden, or going through the desert again, to get to the garden to meet the lover. And so that's why you have like Mary Magdalene. She's up early in the morning searching for her love. Does that make sense? And it's a scriptural image that is in Proverbs, that one is searching the city looking for their lover. That's what Mary Magdalene is doing. She gets up early and takes this journey looking for a lover. That's what we're doing. So Lent really is this time for lovers. It's us being called back into the desert to get rid of the idols in our heart. And so Lent's a time where we die for love. Just want to pause you there because you guys have strange looks on your face, which kind of used to. Yes?
The expression falling in love, is that from the Hebrew, or where that comes from?
I don't know where the expression falling in love comes from, but I don't ever remember anything in Hebrew. Really, the more biblical notion would be dying to love.
Because falling sounds pretty passive.
Yeah, falling does sound passive.
Humpty Dumpty off the wall.
Yeah, but I think like even before you fall in love, you have to be willing to have your heart sacrificed. But anyone else? Okay. So on this image of Lent is for lovers, there's this ancient, actually it comes from the Greeks, but there's this ancient image and mystical tradition that when we're created, when God creates us, before we're born, we're given that God kisses us, and we're given the kiss of perfect love. And for the rest of our life, we're searching for that love that first kissed us. And that's why, like, the Greeks would say, when you're trying to remember something, you put your finger to your lips. And so that's recalling the primordial kiss. That you're trying to remember something you forgot. And what it is love. And the mystics would say our entire life we're looking for that perfect kiss of love. But here's the strange part. Love is not gained by addition. It's gained by subtraction. And what I mean by that is that to truly love, Meister Eckhart goes into this a lot, that the Christian way, the way of the mystic, is subtraction, not addition. It's not adding more stuff to your life. It's emptying your heart so that you can love. It's dying. And you have to travel a long ways to learn to give up your ego. It's your ego that interferes with your ability to love. And it takes a lifetime of traveling through there. So, like, they did this study on happiness, and I just find this strange. Do you know which age group tends to be the happiest? Senior citizens.
Yes.
Which makes no sense, because when you're younger, you have money. Like, when you're younger, you have great health. Like, you have far less problems. And yet, over a lifetime, when you're older, that's when you have your most financial problems, medical problems, and yet they always test out happier. Why is that? It's just this strange paradox. And I just like to think because you've died to a lot of ego. Your problems are far more serious when you're older, but you have less ego. Or the strange story of this couple from St. Mark's who I knew from high school, and they always seemed to have a good marriage, right? But then I found out when I was in college and went to college with their kids. Went to college with their kids. Then I found out that their parents' marriage was far more tumultuous, and they had these fights, and I found that really shocking. And then when I was a priest, I meet the couple again, except this time they're really in love with each other. And so, like, in my mind, I was like, but I know what those fights were about. And later as a priest, when they're an older couple, they really love each other. And then they died just a short time ago. She died first, then he died. And their kids were saying their life ended on this idyllic marriage where, they truly loved each other. And so, like I was talking to one of them, I said, yeah, that's really strange because in high school, they had this contentious marriage, but they died, like the kids, I think this is amazing. Their kids said, one of them said to me, I hope my marriage becomes as good as my parents. And I said, you mean arguing over gardening? Because they had this argument over gardening. And I was just joking, but it really did end in this great love affair where one was taking care of each other. But I think it takes a lifetime to learn how to die to your ego. Does that make any sense? Where you end up in love. So Lent is this journey into love. But how you gain love is not by getting more, quite the opposite. It's by giving up, subtraction, dying to ego. That's why older people, I think, test out to be happy. And so the history of Lent is, yes, this journey, but I like to think a journey into love. And I just want to make something, like, I have a problem with, and there's a lot of Catholics and some priests who think this way, that Lent, you're focusing too much on sacrifice. Just be happy. I find that really offensive because you'll never get to happy by just trying to be happy. You have to get to happy through the cross. How you get back to the Garden of Eden is by going through the desert. Does that make any sense? I just find that such a heresy. And here's the odd part. So Lent is this history of making this journey into love. But here's the really odd part. Lent is really, the primary issue of Lent is not about you. It's about those coming into the church. That we develop, yes, Lent for conversion, but Lent is about us showing the people who are coming into the church, this is what conversion looks like. It's not addition, it's subtraction. And it takes time, a lifetime of dying before you get love. That's what we're showing them. It takes time to discover your true self. Your true self is a matter of a lot of stripping away. And so back to the Garden of Eden story with Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree, it says immediately that they were ashamed of their nakedness. It doesn't say nudity. It says nakedness. So what is nakedness? Your nakedness is your true self. Exactly who you are, that you can show up without any masks or mirage. And clothes, at this point, clothes are the masks we wear to project an image to other people. Does that make sense? So clothes are protecting us from who we can pretend to be. And you think, well, I don't understand what you're talking about. So I told the story before. When I was in California, I met this priest who everybody called a cowboy priest, right? And, okay, I'm being rude. He had this big tattoo on his arm that said, cowboy up. Which, that's all right. And when you walked into his office, he had a pair of leather chaps in a picture frame. So, and pictures of horses and all this other stuff. So, I was talking to him once. I said, well, if you come up to Idaho, I have friends who have horses. We could go horseback riding. And he was like, oh. So I mentioned it a second time, and then it clicked. And I said, you've never been on a horse, have you? And he hadn't. But, like, that whole cowboy image, it was a masquerade ball. There's nothing, he was actually, to be honest, this huge not cowboy, he was this huge coward. And he just it's, to me, it's like people who like to wear dog tags, but were never in the military. There's this guy who was working out at the gym. I haven't seen him, but very hugely muscular, wearing dog tags. So I asked him. I said, "Oh, what branch of the service were you?" And he says, "Oh, I just bought these for affect." And I said, "I know somebody who could turn those into reality if you want." So when I say clothes are a masquerade, does that they kind of hide who we truly are a lot of times. And so really, when Adam and Eve put on those clothes, they're stripped of, they're ashamed of their nakedness, of exactly who they are. And if you notice, Christ and the cross is stripped of his clothing, which does mean something. But the idea is that Christ can be, and he was actually crucified completely naked. We just don't put that up in our churches. But the stripping means that he could be stripped of everything and not lose his true dignity. Does that nakedness is not? It's not about nudity. It's about he can be completely who he is. So in the book of Revelation, heaven is pictured as this wedding feast, and everybody's wearing these wedding dresses. It's this feast of love. We're back into paradise. We're back into paradise, and we're clothed with love now. That's what the wedding dress means. In one sense, we've regained our nakedness. And so, going back to the Genesis story, Adam and Eve, they're kicked out of the garden. Well, they kicked themselves out of the garden, by the way. God doesn't kick them out. Because they've chosen selfishness, they can't live in the garden of love. So they're in exile. And the rest of the Bible story, in one sense, I can explain the entire Bible story by saying it's Adam and Eve's search, humanity's search, to get back into the garden. And we choose all the wrong ways. Power, control. How do you get, and the clue is written in the story itself. How do you get back into the Garden of Eden? There's one door you have to go through. But what's guarding the entrance of the Garden of Eden? Well, actually, it's cherubs, but it doesn't. So there's cherubs there. Cherubs are always on the entranceway, and a flaming sword. Now, it doesn't technically say the angel is holding a flaming sword, but it's this flaming sword. And believe it or not, once a year we act that out. What the flaming sword, I'll just tell you what the flaming sword is. It's both a symbol of the Holy Spirit, flame, and the sword is sacrifice. The way back into the Garden of Eden is through the cross. Does that make sense? You have to be able to sacrifice yourself. Not, get power or even moral rules and regulations. It's about self-sacrifice. So, in the book of Revelation, when John goes into heaven, he sees Christ dressed as an angel. That's a little freaky, and he's having flames in his eyes and holding a sword. He is the flame. Does that make any sense? So the only way into heaven is through the self-sacrifice of Christ. It's trying to make. Do you get the image? That's how John gets back into this feast of love. And if you're wondering, well, where in the Catholic Church do we play that out? Well, it's in the Triduum of the cross. So we celebrate Good Friday, but on Easter Saturday, and I have to admit, I don't do this because I've slimmed down the right. But technically, it's supposed to start outside with this bonfire, and the bonfire symbolizes the pillar of fire. And the priest takes a knife and he stabs the Paschal candle 5 times. The idea is that the pillar of the Paschal candle becomes the flaming sword. Does that make sense? That's how we get back into the Garden of Eden. But the image is that of sacrifice. And Eden, by the way, just means potential. How you reach your true potential is through sacrifice.
What was the symbolism of 5, stabbing it 5 times?
The 5 wounds of Christ. How you get into paradise is also because you're wounded. Through the wounds of Christ and actually your wounds. So I love that. I love that. It's through the sacrifice of Christ that is the door, but it's also our wounds. Wounds are very important. You're not getting into paradise unless you have some wounds. That's a bizarre thought, but that's our... even sweating blood, love demands a true sacrifice. And there was this show years ago, a TV show that I didn't watch, but I saw one episode I liked, so I'm just going to... it was called 30-something. It's about the travails of being 30-something. I can't remember that. But there's a strange scene where, and I forget what it is, they're at like this cocktail party or after work, and there's this married guy and this young woman, and it does this great job of kind of acting out how there's this tension between them. Does that make sense? And, the love, the flirting, the little bit of, you just can see it. It's kind of cute and fun. And so as they're about to go home, there's this lingering conversation. Do you know what it is? And then at the end she says, do you want to get together sometime? And in him, I mean, it was all fun, but then there's this pause. And the pause is, you can see him thinking about it, but then he says no. And it's this great image that he sacrifices. Does that make any sense? Like, he's getting the whole, oh gosh, this is so cute, but he chooses his wife. Does that make any sense? And the show did a good job of showing the tension, and I shouldn't tell you this, but really you should never tell me something because I might use it. So there's this guy, I think they're an amazing couple, Joan and John Carley. And John Carley, he was the president of Albertsons, and he says, he says this right at dinner too, so he says, you know what, as president of Albertsons, these young girls would kind of, he didn't use the word come on, but they'd kind of flirt. And he said, I have to admit, as an old man, I'd be like, I still got it. And then he said, the truth would come to him, and he said, oh, yeah, you're right. And he says, I'm an old man. And I always think, what are these girls doing? I'm happily married. Does that make any sense? And I love how the fact that he could be so honest. And this priest father once said, and father was talking about marriage, and he said, sometimes to remain faithful in love, you have to sweat a little blood. Like, isn't that a great line? It just brings back the garden, their Garden of Gethsemane, that sometimes in gardens and cocktail parties and during Lent, you have to pay this price for love, and it's sweating a little blood. Does that make any sense? Or, like, I know this other couple who were going to get married, and they chose not to get married because basically he had an anger issue, which is fine. My people have anger issues. But so I met with him because they were calling off the wedding, and he had these huge anger issues. And I saw it in this marriage prep where he starts to say, why can't you just change? Why can't you just change? Like, why can't he just want to change? Like, he has the anger issues. I'm sure she has issues too. But he never thought that he had to change. He's never going to sweat blood. She has to. Does that make any sense? If you're going to get to the Garden of Eden, you have to go through the desert. You have to be willing to sacrifice your anger and all that other stuff. So my point being is that where does the next generation of Catholics learn this? And it's supposed to be us during Lent. We show them to enter the church, it's sacrifice. To enter into paradise, into heaven, it's sacrifice. To get back to the Garden of Eden, even in your marriage, it looks a lot like sacrifice. Lent is a time for sacrifice. The other image is, remember, Lent is also a journey. So if you look at the Garden of Eden, this sounds kind of strange. Where's the Garden of Eden? I don't mean physically what country, but on what geographical, thing. I'll just tell you because I'm not expressing. The Garden of Eden is on top of a mountain. In the Garden of Eden, you have 4 rivers, right? And they all flow down. How is that possible? It's because it's on a mountain. Does that make sense? So on the top of the mountain is the Garden of Eden. And remember, like last week I told you about the Psalms of Ascent? If you go up to Jerusalem, you have to go up. It's on top of a mountain. So when it speaks about high places in the Old Testament, that's where altars are made. High places are the top of the mountain where you would meet God, because in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden is on top of a mountain. Also, the steps that, it was this ancient custom. If you go up to the altar, there's always steps because you're ascending the mountain of God. Does that make sense? And on the top of a mountain of God is paradise. But if you look at all those Psalms, climbing the mountain is supposed to be tough. Getting to the Garden even is a journey, and it's a journey of sacrifice. So even like, I love the Teresa of Lisieux comment where, if you know who Teresa of Lisieux is? Yeah. But I love her where she's talking about her theology is a theology of love, but she incorporates sacrifice in it as well. But she says, I'm on the base of the mountain, and I want to get to the top of the mountain. I may not know how to get there. I may not know how to get there, but God gave me this desire for love, this desire to get to the top of the mountain. So that will get me there. God wouldn't have given me the desire unless it was possible. And she admits she has a lot of problems. She has a lot of things against her. But the one thing she has is this desire for love. And with a desire for love, you'll sacrifice whatever you need. Wait, if you go up the mountain and you realize, I can't go that way, I'll go this way. But you'll get there because you have this desire for sacrifice that leads to love. So, yes, Lent is this journey, and the journey is supposed to be hard. Otherwise, you don't sacrifice yourself, and the two don't become one.
Before you go any further, I'd like to go back to the Garden of Eden. And before you can get in there, you have to have wounds. What kind of wounds are you talking about?
Okay, very good that you caught that. But yes, you have to have wounds to get into the Garden of Eden. Can I save that because that's coming up in a second? Or, well, you better get wounds, woman. Well, just on this idea that you need the desire. So there's a strange thought in Catholicism that how do you get into heaven? Well, we would say, well, actually, you don't get into heaven. You get heaven into you first. So it's not a matter of you die and then you jump over into heaven. You have to first get heaven a little bit in you. Like St. Teresa of Lisieux, she had a lot of problems. She admits it. She is a little bit of a brat, but she had this desire. And it starts with this desire. So we would say, well, heaven and earth just slightly overlap. And where it overlaps is hopefully your heart. That's where you discover this desire. So I want to talk about the Jacob story because it's one of my favorite stories, and it'll explain the wounds. So if you don't know the Jacob story, Jacob is the younger twin, Esau and Jacob. And Esau is the oldest and the favorite of his father, but Jacob is a favorite of his mother. His mother had this vision in the womb that Jacob, the second child, will inherit the blessing. So Rebecca is very tricky, but the will of God showed her when she was pregnant. It's going to be Jacob, not the firstborn. So anyhow, Jacob is incredibly selfish. He's a liar, he's a cheat. The name Jacob means trickster or supplanter. Esau has his problems. He's angry and arrogant. And anyhow, so Jacob tricks, and this was the big thing he wanted, the blessing. Jacob tricks his father into giving him the blessing. And when Esau finds out about it, he promises to kill his brother. He stole the most precious thing, the blessing. And so Jacob has to run for his life. And to be honest, he's going to spend his life running. He's a runaway. He's literally the prodigal son who's run away. And his whole life is kind of this runaway, this journey. And he is incredibly selfish, and I love this. The first night on his run, he puts a stone there and falls asleep. And when he falls asleep, he has this image of angels running up and down this stairway. And before he went to sleep, he said this prayer, and I love this prayer, where he says, God, I will believe that you exist if you give me a beautiful wife, lots of children, and great wealth. Such a beautiful prayer. Who prays like that? And God comes to him in a dream and says, the Lord is with you. Jacob, I will take you up on that bet because I am a better trickster. I am a better Jacob than you are. And in the morning, Jacob, it's this great act. Jacob thinks, oh my gosh, I must have stumbled upon this place where heaven and earth just slightly over. So he takes the rock and he builds an altar. And later, as an old man, he'll bring his sons back to that spot and say, there is where my life started to change. And the next day, he gets near water, and what happens? He falls in love. And he's in love with this woman, so that Jacob, for the first time, gets tricked into servitude. And anyhow, so that's, I'll come back to that story, but that's that idea that heaven and earth just slightly oversect. So in the temple, when the temple is built, you have palms, and you circle the palms 7 times, praying for God's presence. So, just skipping over that. So we'd say, well, no, you have to get kind of this heaven into you. So Jacob, his whole life is this journey in this Camino. And his brother wants to kill him, but he's decided he's got to journey back and meet his brother. You know, he's an old man now. And that night, he takes his family, his children, and he's kind of scared because Esau already had a bad temper and had promised, but he's going to go back to his brother and face up to what he did. Does that make any sense? So there's this great story that as an old man, the night before he comes back, it always happens at night, this angel comes. And this angel wrestles with him all night long. And as sometimes Jacob is ahead, and other times the angel is ahead. And finally at the end, the angel cheats. The angel cheats and touches his hip socket so it goes out. And for the rest of his life, Jacob will have to limp. But his hip socket is thrown out. And so the angel pins him. And the angel pins him and says, now I change your name. You were Jacob, trickster, but now God is changing your name to Israel. Israel means one who wrestles with God. That's what the name means. And Jacob says, I have wrestled with God and lost. And it's in the losing that I've become a new man. So when it says Jacob, it means trickster, selfish, but by the time he gets to become an old man of wrestling with God, he's changed into a saint, a holy man. His name is Israel, one who wrestles with God. And yes, he will get into return back to the promised land only by limping. That's his wound. That's why don't Jews in that story, it doesn't eat any of the meat from that socket. So why can't Jews eat filet mignon? Because I don't really know what filet mignon is, but they say it comes from somehow the hip area. Is that true? I don't know. I don't know. Well, anyhow, they're not allowed to eat any meat that comes from that area in deference to, I don't know what a filet mignon is, but they're not allowed to eat meat from the hip area because it says in the Bible the descendants of Jacob, they're to remember this. Well, remember what? Well, remember that Judaism is not really about what you... In Judaism is about what you eat and what you don't eat, so is Catholicism. But you don't eat that as this perpetual reminder of the sacredness of people's wounds. That's Jacob's wound. And he's hurt. But that's how he becomes a holy man, is because of his wounds. And then, does that make any sense? Like, you become holy because of your wounds. Does the story make sense to you? So if you don't know, there's a Jewish story, and the Jewish story is, what is love? And there's two men in a bar sitting together, and they're best friends, and the other one says, do you know what hurts me? And the other one says, no, I don't know. And he replies, if you loved me, you would know where my wounds are. I just like that. But it's by our wounds that we're healed. And the older and older you get, the Jacob becomes an Israel. You'll end up wounded, but your wounds will end up at love. That's what's going to get you into the promised land. So, like even Hemingway said, life breaks us all, but for some of us, we're strong in the broken places. The great gift that we can offer God sometimes is our wounds, because it's our wounds where we learned love. So Jacob is wounded, and the next day he limps and he goes disarmed. He goes with his entire family, and he goes disarmed to meet Esau. And what happens? What happens is that Esau had huge anger issues, rightfully so, especially with Jacob. And they see each other, and they fall and wrap their arms around each other and kiss. That now all there is love. Does that make sense? It's this great story of forgiveness and reconciliation. Like last week we talked about forgiveness, that forgiveness is what you give yourself to be free from bitterness. Reconciliation is what you offer somebody else. And I love this, that two children, sons, who absolutely hated each other, at the end of their life, because of their wounds, they end up in love with each other again. That there is this reconciliation. So yes, it's by our wounds that we enter into heaven. The reason why the people chose the name Israel as a nation, they could have chose the name Abrahamites or Isaacites, but they chose Israel because this is the story of every true human being. That you must wrestle with God, and you're going to lose that fight. But you wrestle with God, and you'll end up wounded. But it's through wounds that you enter back into the promised land. And so in heaven, by wounds, in heaven, in the book of Revelation, this sounds odd. In the book of Revelation, Christ still has his wounds in heaven. There's a lot of meanings there. That the body of Christ is still wounded, but it means this: when you meet Christ, Christ still has his wounds, and he's going to say, here are my wounds, where are yours? And if you've never been wounded out of sacrificing for love for another, you're not going to make it into heaven. Heaven is guarded by a flaming sword. It's by sacrifice. Does that make sense? So I love the idea that we get the ashes on Ash Wednesday, and you end up kissing the cross on Good Friday. That really, this life of sacrifice, that's how you get into heaven. It's by our wounds that we get into heaven. So does that explain what I mean?
Okay, so the brothers saw each other and they embraced and loved. But Esau had a lot of anger, so who touched him too?
God did. Esau the same thing.
You didn't say that.
Well, I know, but that's... but Esau as well had misfortune and pain. God says, I have done evil to Esau. When it says evil, it doesn't mean satanic evil, but God visited misfortune upon Esau as well. That Esau, he gets wounded and gets freed from his anger.
So can the wounds be other than physical?
Oh yeah, I think the wounds are truly... the physical wounds are only a symbol. But I think all the wounds are really in your heart. Because some people can get wounded physically and they end up more bitter. Like Ecclesiastes talks about that. Why is it some people go through hardship and they learn to love? Other people, they go through hardship and they're just bitter and angry at everybody else. But does that make sense? By our wounds that we are healed?
So they're emotional wounds?
Or emotional, spiritual, psychological, call it what you want, but they're wounds. I don't know what to call them. So.
Well, at one point I was thinking about how did Christ get wounded? Well, he was abandoned by friends, rejected, Peter didn't even show up when he needed him. And that's the way to be
Yeah,
wounded.
Christ is truly wounded by us, the lover. We're the ones who wounded Christ, and he took it. Oh, yes, Catherine.
Don't you think we have to spend time figuring out our woundedness and facing it? And I think sometimes we don't because we're always trying to look happy in that. But
No,
we have to
I think a lot of
reflect
people.
on our wounds.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't reflect on their own wounds. Don't even know it. Like if you ask Jacob, what's wrong with Esau? I don't think when he's younger, he's not going to say, well, because I am a liar and a cheat. That's what's wrong. You know, like, and if you ask Esau, how come, what's wrong? He's not going to say, I have huge anger issues. Because Jacob did cheat him and did that. Does that make any sense? Like, I think a lot of people don't recognize their own wounds. Or the married couple who called it off, or engaging couple who talk. The guy can't see his own anger. It's her. She's got to change. Like, I don't think a lot of people see their own wounds. So.
But Father, in the story, I read it later. When Jacob left, his brother Esau, all the right that his mother wanted for him anyway.
Esau what?
He was supposed to be the second born, right?
Jacob was, yeah.
So his mother wanted him to be the one to be born first so he can inherit everything. But at the time that Jacob leaves and left, so his brother did everything.
His brother got everything, you're right, except the blessing, which is the most important. The most important thing was the blessing of the father. But the mother, in this odd way, she does the will of God. God gave her this vision in the womb that it's the second who is supposed to receive everything. So in this, she technically breaks the law and lets the second son inherit. But she does the will of God. It's a strange story that you think Rebecca's a horrible mother but she did exactly what God asked her to do. And the one thing Rebecca is good at is, hard work. She's known for hard work. And she too is as clever as Jacob.
I had another thing. It's an interesting story. And what nation did Esau become?
I think the Edomites.
Mm-hmm.
The Edomites. You can look it up, but I think it's the Edomites.
Because Jacob became Israel and Esau.
The Messiah comes from Jacob. Oh, yes.
Are sacrifice and suffering interchangeable when you say?
No. I don't think sacrifice and suffering are the same things because I don't think all suffering is redemptive. But I think some suffering is redemptive. And I think it's us who get to make that choice. I know that sounds strange, but I think, all suffering can be redemptive. But not all suffering is a sacrifice. Did that confuse you? Okay, so I just love this idea that Lent is for lovers. Yeah, we take up this very ancient way of sacrificing something in ourselves. That's why I personally don't like it when people, I don't care about people, Catholics, they go with Lent as something light. I don't want to be light. I want my heart ripped open. I want my side ripped open, so what can overflow is love. Okay, so one last story, and then I told this on Ash Wednesday, so it's just a repeat, but I just like it because I like the idea of the cross. So I'm going to retell this story if I can. And that is the swallows of Capistrano. They always leave on the sometime in March, around the feast of Saint Joseph. And they leave, and the people notice that they did this strange thing, that the birds, before they'd leave, they'd pick up a twig and fly, and they're going hundreds of miles, and they'd fly with this twig. And they just, kind of that stupid birds, it makes no sense. Why would you fly with a twig? It only makes it more difficult. But then fishermen noticed that what the birds would do is that they would land in the water, and they'd drop the twig and then land on the twig. And as the twig would float, it would allow them to float. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then when they got rested, they would fly off and pick up the twig and fly more. But anyhow, so to me, it's this great analogy of the cross, that this thing that makes the journey burdensome also makes it possible. That's to me, an amazing thought, that the cross makes the journey into heaven possible, but it makes it burdensome as well. Your wounds, your afflictions, it makes the journey hard, but it makes the journey possible. I can't explain things well, especially to high school students. And if you have to explain the cross, it's illogical. Why would you, when there's, if you could have a steak and a great meal, why would you choose a poor meal? Why would you look at your sins if it's only going to cause, guilt and pain? Why would you? It's not logical. And the cross is not logical. And Lent is not logical. But the burden makes the journey possible. And makes it possible for love. So, all right, so...
Okay, I want to say this because now that you mentioned that, the story of Capistrano and the swallows, I told my family the other day, we were driving, and I tell them things and they never believe me. So here is my daughter-in-law in the telephone, on Google or whatever. She found the story. So, it's true.
All right, see you guys later.